Why do airplane windows have that tiny hole? That little hole sitting near the bottom of the window, the hole is actually there on purpose. We first have to understand something slightly terrifying about flying. When an airplane is cruising at thousands of feet above the ground, the air outside is much thinner than the air we need to breathe comfortably down here. So the airplane does something extremely important. It pressurizes the cabin. The cabin is kept at a pressure much higher than the air immediately outside the airplane. In a typical airliner, the cabin pressure is controlled to correspond roughly to an altitude around 8,000 feet, even while the aircraft itself may be cruising much higher. So while you are sitting there eating your tiny packet of peanuts, the airplane is basically carrying its own little bubble of breathable atmosphere. And that creates a problem, because if you've got higher pressure inside and lower pressure outside, the pressure difference is constantly pushing against the airplane structure. That includes the windows. And this is why airplane windows aren't just one giant piece of glass. They are built in layers. Modern passenger cabin windows typically use multiple panes, with structural panes separated by an air gap plus an inner pane on the cabin inside. Think of it less like a window and more like a tiny transparent sandwich. Except this sandwich has to survive thousands of feet in the sky, and unfortunately nobody wants to eat it. Now we finally get to our tiny hole. Remember that there are layers. The outer structural panes deal with the pressure loads created by the pressurized cabin, but there is also a small space between the window layers, and that space contains air. Here is the problem. If that trapped air couldn't communicate with the cabin, the pressure inside that little space could behave differently from the cabin pressure. So engineers gave it a tiny pathway. That little hole allows pressure in the space between the panes to equalize with the cabin. That's the job. Okay, but wait, if there is a hole in the window, doesn't that mean the freezing, nearly airless outside atmosphere can just come through? Like whoosh. Welcome on board. Please enjoy the complimentary oxygen. No, thankfully. The tiny hole is in the inner pane, not simply a hole punched through the entire aircraft. The airplane's actual pressure boundary remains protected by the structural window assembly. That tiny opening is part of the window's design, not a shortcut through the fuselage. And that distinction is extremely important. There is another detail that makes this even more interesting. Those multiple layers aren't there because aircraft engineers enjoy making unnecessary, complicated windows. Although, I wouldn't completely rule that out. They are there because an airplane window has to deal with some serious forces. The window has to withstand the pressure difference between the cabin and the outside. It also has to deal with the temperature difference, movement of the structure, and the stresses that come with repeated pressurization cycle. And that's why the shape matters too. And in the next video, I will be explaining the reason why the window shape is like that. And you need to subscribe if you want to watch that video, because it's very important and it complements this one. So let's put everything together. You are flying thousands of feet above the ground. The cabin is pressurized. The outside pressure is much lower. The window has multiple layers. There is an air space between some of those layers, and the tiny hole helps that space communicate with the cabin so pressure can equalize appropriately. Meanwhile, the structural window panes are designed to carry the cabin pressure load, so that microscopic hole isn't weakening the airplane. It's part of how the window is designed to handle the environment it's operating in. And here's the part I love. Something that looks like a manufacturing mistake, it's actually evidence of extremely deliberate engineering. Think about how tiny that hole is. You could probably stare directly at it for years and never wonder what it does. Because when you're designing something that carries thousands of people through an environment humans were never meant to live in, even a hole smaller than your fingernail matters. And that's what makes everyday engineering so fascinating. We tend to think of engineering as the giant stuff: engines, wings, landing gear, all the dramatic things that look impressive. But sometimes the smartest part of the design is the thing you almost never notice. A tiny hole, a curved corner, a little gap between two layers. Something that looks completely insignificant can be doing an incredibly important job. So the next time you're sitting beside an airplane window, look down, find that tiny little hole. And remember, you're not looking at a defect. You're looking at a tiny piece of engineering that helps a multi-ton machine carry a pressurized bubble of air through the sky, which is pretty impressive for a hole. And if you want more explanation for the weird little things you've been staring at your entire life without questioning, you know where to find me. Smash that subscribe button and turn on your notification bell for the next discovery.